My name is Professor Chris Chávez. I'm a professor in the School of Journalism and Communication. I'm the director of the Center for Latina, Latino, Latin American Studies. And then I also head up the working group for the Hispanic Serving Institution. And then finally direct the Masters in Advertising and Brand Responsibility program. I teach advertising, and then I work with our doctoral student teaching qualitative methods. I first went to Cuba in 2000, and at the time you weren't allowed to go there, so you could go through Mexico and then fly over from Cancun to Havana. So I went there in 2000, and from an advertising perspective, I was really fascinated by a society in which there really was no advertising. So they had billboards and they had public spaces, but they weren't used to sell products or commodities. They were used to celebrate like revolutionary heroes or things that were collective in orientation. So things like conserve water, saving energy is for the good of the community. So it was advertising spaces, but they weren't used to sell, individual products or commodities. They were used for the collective good. And so I was really fascinated by, that kind of society that was removed from capitalism in the way that we know it here. And some of the scholars that I've read make the point that so much of Cuba is presented through the lens of Western journalists, people that are in the US or people that are in Europe. And we rarely hear from the people that are still living on the island, still struggling day to day, still trying to make sense of this whole project of the communist revolution. And so reading more Cuban artists, writers. And so that's one of the things that I was really careful not to do, was to say, this is a claim on Cuban culture, which I don't know. Like, I'm not Cuban. I don't know enough about the history compared to people that live there. But what I do know are Western advertising executives and Western journalists and their history of representation. So that was more the focus of the book, rather than on trying to lay claim on what Cuban politics and culture is and isn't. It was toward the end of the Obama administration, and at that time Obama was just about to open up relationships with Cuba, and so he was making gestures. He went over to Havana, lifted some of the restrictions. So it looked like there was a moment in time when some of the trade was going to be reopened again after about 60 years with the embargo. And so a lot of companies were interested in entering Cuba. And so that's what it first started, which is, how will Cuba change? It's been a socialist country for close to 60 years. How is it going to change once capitalism starts to flow back in there? It seemed like a really important moment in time. Since then, things have changed. So Trump took over, closed off any kind of negotiations with Cuba, and so there was some steps backward. When President Biden took over, he didn't seem to have any interest in investing any kind of political equity in normalizing relationships. It doesn't look like any foreseeable future that whatever doors were being opened have now just been slammed shut. So, but for that short moment of time, there was a lot of promise of things going back to normal relationships. Again, that's 8, maybe 9 years that it was taking to write it from when I first started working on it. Yeah, I hope they take away a couple of things. One is that the world of commodities all have a dark history. Whenever you look at something as benign as rum, but it could be anything. It could be chocolate and candy bars. Like, the process of making those things usually involves some form of exploitation from somewhere. And there are people that profit from it, and then people that are exploited through that process. So just sort of making those dynamics visible. And that's true of many different kinds of products. But the focus was on rum. And so looking at sort of the history of rum and the history of colonization, and the history of exploitation within Cuba. So I would like them to take away that, but also to look at the history of Cuba through this one brand of rum. It starts off under Spanish colonialism and then changes again, like it really grows under the US occupation of Cuba in the early 1900s, then becomes something else during the communist revolution, and now it's trying to figure out something new to be under globalization. And so it's this one brand that's really had to reinvent itself over time because of dramatic shifts in the politics and the economy. To look at the global connections. And so in the case of Cuba, this brand was started by a Spanish immigrant. And so you have kind of an immigrant community that came from northern Spain and another community that came from like Barcelona, the Catalonia region. One of those families started Bacardi. The other one that started off in northern Spain started the Arechabalas. They started Havana Club. And so they were competing brands of rum over time. Cardenas, which is the city where the Arechabala family came to, and they landed in Cuba. And they were wildly successful for years. They made a ton of money. And during the 20s and 30s, they invested so much money into the Cuban infrastructure there. They had their own theater. They built a railway system that could take sugar from the plantations to the ships. And it was their city. It was a really prominent name. Once the revolution happened, their identities were erased, essentially. So they fled to Miami and started again there. They lost everything, in that part of the process. But when you go to the city itself, there is no trace of them. And so as part of this research, I went to the city of Cardenas, which was an important port city during the, 1800s and 1900s. And so this passage is about that visit to that part of the city. Okay. Aside from a few references, traces of the Arechabal family can no longer be seen, either from the product that he created or the city he once called home. In Cardenas, one is likely to encounter a number of memorials dedicated to revolutionary heroes, but evidence of the once prominent family in Cardenas can no longer be found. The once grand Arechabala Theater that was once unveiled in 1919 is no longer there, and the former Arechabala home has now been turned into a public library. It is uncertain what these erasures mean. Perhaps they are simply signaled the drift away from private enterprise during the Cuban Revolution, or perhaps the new revolutionary government resented the Arechabalas from leaving Cuba after the revolution. The family would have been moving amongst the first wave of white, wealthy Cubans who left for the United States after the revolution. These are the people that Castro pejoratively called the gusanos. The victors create the storytelling. So they have museums to themselves, they are able to craft their own family narrative, and they position themselves as single-handedly inventing Cuban rum. And then you have this other family that has just been lost in the history books. And so in some ways I hope the book reclaims some of that history. But because they've just sort of been lost. I went a couple of different times. So the first time I said in 2000, and that one was much more covert because at that time there was a lot stricter regulations. When I came in 2019, I went for the biennial, which is like this big art festival that draws in people from all over the world. So I'm part of here at the university with the George Snitzer Museum. And so I was able to go with that group, visit with artists, visit with galleries, and so that was really important. And then I went again maybe in 2022. And by that time, it's relatively easier now than it was in 2000. So you can go under the pretense of it's called helping the Cuban people. So as long as you're not staying in a state-run hotel and you stay with, you can get Airbnb there and stay with a private family and are helping them to become kind of small business people, then the U.S. doesn't really look down on that. So they're much more open to travel, at least. There's been a couple of people that, when I was doing research for the project, they were really supportive. One was an NPR journalist named Tom Gelton. He wrote a book on Bacardi. And so that became one of the reference points that I looked to see, how do you attack something like this? And it was a well-received book. And so when I reached out to him just to sort of get his thoughts, he was just generous in terms of providing materials that were hard to find, just being a supporter of the project. So I think that was a nice kind of gesture. But mostly from the journalism community, I'd say that, again, had heard about this project, had been kind of either reporting about Cuba or Puerto Rico, because a lot of Cubans left Cuba to go to other parts of the Caribbean, and just how supportive they were and gave me materials and were generous with their time and insight. So I think that's been very, kind of a nice benefit of this. Working on a book on the Los Angeles Times. So I grew up in Southern California, and Mexicans have been there several hundred years, right? Even before it became the United States. And so the Times has, over the years, had a very conflicted relationship with the Mexican American community in Southern California. So I want to kind of trace that history beginning in the 1800s when they were first established to where they are today, and how they've conceptualized Latinos living in Southern California over the years. And so I'll start in the late 1800s and then move through, the early 20s when there was a big, Mexican immigrant community from the Revolution, through the 60s and the 80s and to modern day. And so that's the current project that I'm working on. So I look at cultural production. So those industries that are responsible for creating culture. And so it could be the advertising industry. With the NPR book, it was the public broadcasting system. It's been the television industry. So just looking at these institutions that, again, create culture. And so this is kind of an extension of that thinking and being able to dive into the archives and work, do interviews, which was a little bit harder for this project. But I'm really interested in cultural production, and then the brokers, the ad executives, the journalists, the music producers, that kind of translate culture to the masses. And I have this in the dedication, but just a project like this is always helpful when you get support from so many different people. As I mentioned, so many journalists have been supportive of this project and directing me to different kinds of sources, and in some cases sharing their resources, but also my fellow academics. So I'm not a journalist, but I work with a lot of journalism faculty members, and just being a great sounding board and being supportive of the project over the years. The university was really supportive in terms of giving me money to do some initial travel to Havana. So it's been kind of a well-supported project, I think. Nice. Two brothers, Maurice and Charles Saatchi, and they had started another agency before, a global agency called Saatchi & Saatchi, and then they ended up getting kicked out of there for whatever reason. And then they started a new agency called MNC Saatchi, a global organization. And so they were the ones that were really taking responsibility for working with the Cuban government and working with Pernod Ricard, which is a large global, it's a French transnational liquor company, and then figuring out a way to sell Cuba to Western consumers. And that's really kind of the idea of the project is, how do these cultural brokers, is what I call them, things like advertising executives, music producers, artists, filmmakers, journalists, that profit, like they make money by selling a very specific version of Cuba to Western consumers who desperately crave authentic experiences.